Hey everyone, welcome back. This is session number 5, and today we're going to be covering copywriting. This is probably the most important part of the course because copywriting, as you know, within cold email is the things that will make or break your campaigns and will ultimately help to dictate whether or not you get meetings. So let's dive in. The agenda for this session, like I said, we do have quite a bit of to cover. We're going to go over some strategies, some subject lines, what some tone and styles you can implement, um, how you can provoke curiosity, some formatting basics, what type of personalized variables, what type of structure you should be utilizing, and I'll share like kind of what my thoughts are on templates. And I'll wrap it up with some best practices. All right, let's get in. Okay, let's talk about strategy at first. If we take a step back and we think about what we're trying to do with cold outreach or cold email in general, the goal here is fundamentally is want to send an email that will start conversations. People want to jump in and be like, "Hey, I just want to book meetings." For sure, that's the ideal outcome, but you have to kind of get there, right? A meeting will only happen after you kind of trigger the person's interest and you get a conversation going. So in that sense, you should also be writing in a conversational manner. I also see a lot of the time people get way too formal in their emails, and then it just looks so rough that a person doesn't really want to respond back. Okay. Um, and the other element, and we've seen this kind of come up in, I would say, like in the last maybe 10 or 15 years or so, specifically from a sales copywriting perspective, it's this whole thing of like, how do you trigger some sort of emotional response from your cold emails? And this is really tough, right? There's no cookie cutter approach to this because you really need to know your prospect and how they think and essentially write the way they think. So the best suggestion I have is you want to be using words that your customers use or your prospects use, right? The way you get this done is by looking at customer reviews online, doing your respective user interviews, looking at case studies, also going in and trying to take copy from the person's website, or even looking at interviews that your prospects have done before, right? You want to get nitty and gritty with some of the vernacular, okay? And then ideally, you want to try to use the appropriate words to trigger those respective emotional response. There's like some interesting literature out there to see like on a tactical level how you can do this. For the purpose of this course, I didn't want to get into it because there's other courses completely that just talks about this. For me, what I wanted to do was uh, really just introduce the concept to you, and then we'll go over like some of the basics. All right. Moving on to subject lines. Subject lines are pretty important, and my advice to everyone that I talk to is, keep your subject lines super simple, right? Subject lines will help dictate your open rate along with another variable which I'll bring up momentarily. But some of the stuff you want to avoid in your subject lines is you want to try to be way too specific. You want to avoid being vague. You want to be avoid asking for meeting in the subject line, something that's super believable, and like something that's super spammy, like buy this now or check this out now, like download free guide. You want to avoid all the typical things that you think that will you would that you wouldn't want to be doing. Okay, there's some great subject line graders out there. Again, you can simple Google search away, but like uh, what I would recommend is you just follow kind of best practices and keep your subject lines like super simple. Make sure that it's relevant to the problem. It's kind of useful, precise. You want it to be super, super short, 2 to 4 words at maximum. And ideally include something the prospect or their persona would say, so it catches their eye. And then if you can use a colleague or a customer name. This is more for like referral campaigns, but this could work well if you're doing something more one-to-one. Obviously, if you're scaling it, then you would need to find the respective individuals' names. But this is something that's usually eye-catching, right? Um, and the other thing I want to talk about is this whole thing of preview text, and I think this is changing the game for your open rates. For open rates right now, people are always talking about, hey, what are your subject lines? How are they performing and stuff. The reason you want to keep your subject lines like 2 to 3 words only is because you have a, a chunk of your first sentence or so shown as a preview text, and this will change uh, per email client, whether you're using Gmail or Outlook, and on the device, whether you're using mobile or desktop. Okay, I've just posted one preview thing that I got, and like I didn't even have to open the email. I was trying to coordinate a meeting with some individual, and then you can see from there, okay, fine, like the guy's confirmed. Okay, I can go on, move on, right? So this is kind of the holy grail here. If you can perfect your subject line and this preview text, it will dramatically improve your open rates here, right? And we'll talk about like kind of what should be your first opening line and stuff, but I just want to kind of introduce the concept now for you. Want to talk a little bit about tone. In literal the definition of tone, it typically refers to the mood implied by the author, word choice, and the way the text can make a reader feel. The tone author uses in a piece of writing can evoke any number of emotions and perspectives. Certain attributes of your writing, including voice, inflection, cadence, mood, and style, are related to tone. I took this definition from Masterclass. So for those who don't know, Masterclass is a provider of online courses, and they have one on writing. I think it's called creative writing or writing for book publishing. But I really like this definition because it tells you how important certain language in your email needs to be, because as you're reading it, the person's reading your email to themselves, and they're making all sorts of assumptions and they're coming to all sorts of conclusions. So how they read that message is really important. You want to use relaxed vocabulary. You don't want to use any aggressive words, and also you just want it to read very smoothly. Don't overthink it, but like at the same time, it needs to flow, right? You don't want to go ahead and start putting a lot of technical terminology where it gets confusing, right? And we'll talk a little bit about this as well. The goal really of the tone of your message is that you want to be empathetic and really try to engage the reader. And there's a lot of literature online as well on how to be more empathetic in general. But like I really summarize it down to these three things, and I hope you can action them straight away. Is that ideally you want to give the reader the information they need or want um, upfront. If it's an obvious question, you want to kind of address it upfront, so they're not gonna like reach out to like ask that simple question, right? If for instance, you're if you're competing in a market where extremely pricing competitive, you probably may want to give price upfront because that's an immediate question. Like, hey, okay, I'm paying X with this competitor. Like, can you beat that price, right? Or you bring that up front, right? Just a suggestion, right? The other element is, and I think this works the best, is trying to understand and summarize a situation. The best example I can give here is during the pandemic. During the pandemic last year and 2020, a lot of people were going through all sorts of things. Marketing conferences were shut down. Everyone was going through lockdown, right? That was a great opportunity for a lot of individuals in their cold email to talk about like, hey, how are things going with this lockdown? Like, how are you feeling? How's your business still operating? How is your team able to cope with it, right? Like, were you even prepared for remote work, right? Like, you could have these type of conversations and kind of lead it and link it back to your solution, right? The last but not least is like, don't go and start pitching your solution straight away. You want to be asking open-ended questions, and we'll talk about that as well. But this is kind of like the main thing around empathy in writing with an empathetic voice, if you wish. The other thing I want to talk about is style. I mentioned this earlier, is that you want to keep your emails conversational. You want to avoid formality. The only time I saw formality work really, really well is when we were prospecting government in the Middle East region, because English was not a first language, it was a second language. So the way that prospect and audience tend to read and write emails is in a very formal tone. I think that was an exception. That was like I think like 1,000 out of the 40, 50,000 emails we did that year, right? Or sorry, that month. So generally what you want to do if you're talking to like a Western audience, North American or Western Europe, I would say try to keep it conversational, and also extremely short sentences. You want to have about 150 words. Less is more. You want to make sure that's non-salesy, and we'll talk about this as well, but you want to have that clear structure and flow to your email, right? Like you just don't want to start throwing out there like, hey, this is what we do, value proposition, and all of that type of stuff. You really need to put it together and all of that. Okay. One other thing I would really mention is like there's something called spam trigger words. This is like buy now, reply this, free. There's about 202 words. A lot of people don't know this, but if you're using any one of these words or a handful of them, your email gets marked as spam straight away by by Gmail or Outlook. So avoid using the spam trigger words. I've highlighted in blue all during the course. You should be able to click it if anything, Google this and get a list of it, right? The other element is like you do not want a confusing structure or confusing layout, right? You don't want to go in there and ask them blankly for something that doesn't make sense, or if they're not the right contact. You want to keep things simple. The last thing is you want to have a very low friction interest based CTA. What that means is, if you're going in and asking for a meeting, that's usually high friction because there's work required, right? And an interested based CTA is like, hey, like, is there any interest there? It doesn't make sense, right? So I've given a couple here to kind of inspire you, but there's so many more, and you can find a bunch of them online. But the one that I like is like, hey, are you interested in learning more? Like the one that I probably use the most is like, would it make sense to continue a conversation via email? Um, Another one is like, would it be the worst idea that we jump on a call, right? Again, that's adding a little bit more friction, but what you want to really do is just make it easy for the prospect to say kind of like yes or no, or say yes or no in the sense that like, does this make sense? Uh, should I book a meeting with this person, or should I even respond back to this individual, right? Is this person worth my time? Okay, so some food for thought for that. Formatting. This is something I see a lot of people miss out on, right? So I just want to go over some stuff here. Really spell check your cold emails. Spelling errors, don't do it on purpose. I know there's some people out there saying, hey, like mess up do some misspells on like the company name or the person's first name, or like some verbs. Like just don't do it. It's not worth it. Like, a cold email, you do want to have that level of professionalism. Capitalize when needed, especially when it's a person's name or company name or city. Otherwise, it just looks really weird and I'll throw the person off, and not in a good way. Use new paragraph and spacing appropriately. I think that's pretty important, because that way, like, nobody wants to look at a block of text, right? And everyone just scans their email. So use paragraphing and spacing to your advantage. Use proper salutations. Again, like, don't keep it super formal. I don't think like people want the dear first name anymore. Like, stick to the hi, hello, hey, salutations, and the sign-offs. Like, you can use best, cheers, kind regards, thanks. Again, stick to the basics, but don't go super formal. uh, I find this interesting. I find two schools of thoughts around this, whether people should use bullet points or not. Bullet points are great because they allow you to be very clear and precise, but at the same time, it does distract your reader or prospect, because when you put bullet points on an email, your eyes go right there, and then you lose focus from the entire other email. So avoid bullet points if you can, and try to communicate it in sentences, because that way your email will have a little bit more of a flow and a structure. I would say only use bullet points if like your email is going to be super short with one line and like three bullet points and then one CTA. Um, don't put your calendar link. Avoid your calendar link at all costs, at least for the first email. You've not gotten permission from your viewer or prospect for a meeting. So like, it makes no sense to put a calendar link. And actually putting links like Calendly and all of that type of stuff, or whichever meeting scheduling app you're using, can impact your deliverability. So at least for the first email, I would say avoid it, right? Avoid anything with I, me, us, we. Like, Don't, it's not about you. It's all about your prospect, right? Use black font only. I don't know why some people want to experiment with different things. Use bold to emphasize something. This is more of, I would say, an advanced technique, and you only want to kind of bold like maximum one or two words to put emphasis, like maybe on a value proposition or maybe on something that you've identified, right? But don't go and bold like nine different things, right? From an aesthetics point of view, that will get your viewer really, really confused. And again, like make sure your font and your sizing and all the formatting is all the same throughout the message. I've seen often that when people are copy pasting from Google Docs into their cold email campaign, the formatting doesn't come through, and then like you have different background text and like different font size. So just again, um, just run a checklist of all these items and just make sure everything is up to par. One thing I want to talk about is, which is a little bit more of an advanced technique in copywriting. It's called staccato, or staccato, depending on how you want to say it. And the proper definition of staccato, it's an adjective. It's used mainly in singing or on audio or I guess orchestra. It's this whole notion of shortened, detached when played or sung. The literal definition, or when it's used for writing, Neil Patel defines it as giving it a rhythm in your copy, right? So the staccato rhythm for one word sentences help draw attention to each individual word. Short sentences are easier to read. If you edit long sentences, just cut them in two. And don't worry about broken sentences. Be brave. Start a sentence with and, but, or because. Try to keep your copy below 12 words per sentence on average. So I thought this was pretty interesting. I got it from his website. He talks more about it, but like try to use this as a interesting as a technique in your copywriting. And like here's an example I put together. So like, hey, first name, uh, product managers should be able to drive strategy. That is why doing a discovery is important. But many PMs don't know how to do one, or do them very badly. Course name changes that. PMs can learn to do discovery from practitioners. These days, individuals run discovery sessions on Google, Facebook, and Amazon. Course name allows you to give access to over 20 hours of content. Plus, you can book a time with a mentor if you get stuck at any point. Interested in learning more? Best, right? So this is probably the first kind of copy or template I've shown in the course in this type of manner. Um, and like you can notice a lot of different things there. One thing is everything is in short sentences. I'm using a staccato rhythm. I'm using open brackets to dictate like, side notes and my thoughts, if you wish, right? Um, I'm using acronyms like PMs because I'm trying to use the same vernacular as this, I guess, prospect or viewer. Um, and then you can see I'm using the three dots kind of as a means to show a break in the sentences, but it's still a continued thought, right? And then I end with a frictionless CTA, right? Um, so I hope this is insightful and valuable, and it does take practice to kind of perfect this type of style, but once you start doing it, it does become a game changer. There's this whole notion in cold outreach around provoking curiosity. I only came across this, I would say, in the last maybe 3.5 years, and I heavily agree with this concept. So I'd love to chat about it more. So this is a guy called Jeff Melander, great individual, highly recommend you follow him. And he talks a little bit about this in more details, but he says the goal of email prospecting is not to get a meeting. It's to provoke a potential buyer to ask, can you tell me more about that? Give prospect tips, tricks, answers, and shortcuts. Make your advice actionable. However, create more questions in the minds of your buyers when giving them advice. This is the part that most sellers forget. Make sure you create an urge in readers. Speak to them in ways that provoke them. Get them to ask you for more specifics about the idea you just gave them. Resist the urge to blatantly ask them to contact you. Instead, lure them. Get them curious, attract buyers to you. So 100% agree with Jeff is saying here. If any of you do follow him on LinkedIn, he's a great guy to just look at his content. I can't emphasize that enough. He prepares slide decks. He creates these long form LinkedIn posts. I believe he has like a coaching program as well. So highly recommend you do check it out. But this whole notion of provoking curiosity is the whole idea that instead of going and pitching really hard to your prospects, get them to start thinking about things that are differently, and make it more problem centric. Like, make them think about those problems, and ideally your product or service solves that problem, right? Instead of putting the problem in front of their face, because then they could be like, yeah, sure, I know how to solve that, right? It'd be like, well, okay, how much are you actually spending to solve that problem, right? um, there's another individual. His name is Josh Brown. He calls it poking the bear, and he gives an example. He's like, "Well, how do you know you're paying for unwanted subscriptions for every month?" That's a question he would pose to his prospect, and he goes on to say, like, "See what I did there? I asked a question that was difficult to answer. Perhaps you thought, I'm not sure." These are called illumination questions. These make you think differently about your current solution. He goes on to talk about illumination questions. They shine a light on the cost of inactions. They pique curiosity because your brain wants to close the gap between what you know and what you want to know. This is called an information gap. What does it cost? What does doing nothing cost your prospect? What's your illumination question? Ditch the pitch, poke the bear, right? Again, highly recommend you also follow him. I think he posts nearly daily. He also has a newsletter. But this whole notion of illumination questions and provoking curiosity, essentially you want to go in and like really uh, ask these questions to your prospect that will make them, again, think about their problem set and be like, okay, that's interesting, right? What makes your questions, or what makes your copy, or what makes your solution interesting? These are the type of things you want to be covering. uh, just some tidbits here, because I know this is a harder concept to grasp, and I hope I'm explaining it well. But elimination questions can be semi-rhetorical, right? They typically start like, well, how have you been doing this? They're designed to get the individual to think, but you don't want them to think too hard, right? The other element is like, the person shouldn't have to physically do anything. Like, we're not asking them to go research or ask a colleague or physically go check something, right? And you typically want to avoid a yes or no type of response, right? So uh, I'll leave you with that. Again, there's a lot more literature on that, but again, it's for more of you to think about, like, okay, how can I structure my copy in such a way where I'm asking these questions, and a lot of these questions are going to be problem centric. So my recommendation is that always, when you're going to write a cold email, just think about the problem you're solving specifically for your prospect, right? And then you kind of want to bring that question or that thought up front. But how are you actually going to be solving that problem, right? And sometimes you really may know the response based on your research, but you still want to ask it so it gets the person to think. You don't want them to just read your email and not walk away with anything, because if they're thinking about something, you're doing what we talked about earlier. You're triggering some curiosity, and you're also, hopefully that curiosity will trigger the respective emotion. We're going to transition into this thing called open-ended questions, which is usually how you want your CTA, your call to actions, to be. And this is the whole idea of like, you want to be asking open-ended questions, typically one in an email. You don't want to ask multiple open questions, right? And the reason we do this is because it's there to make your emails more engaging, right? You want to make your open-ended questions relevant and meaningful. Again, it's usually your CTA, and again, it's there to also like encourage your prospect that you've put some thought into it, and the ultimate goal is that you get some details out of them that you can kind of utilize in other emails. But like I talked about this before, you shouldn't get them to think too much on all of this type of stuff, okay? And lastly, do not ask too many questions. I see a lot of time people write copy and there's asking like 4 questions in an email, right? Typically, you want to have your illumination question, which is kind of rhetorical, which is just designed there to think, right? And then you want to have an open-ended question, which is your CTA. So that open-ended question triggers a person to reply back. So like, hey, I need to answer this question because it's like super interesting, right? Here's some examples. I usually get a lot of questions about this, so I thought I'd put it in here. And like, some of this would look familiar, but like, you can read through this, but I'll just read a couple. It's like, okay, what service related problems are you currently dealing with? how have you handled these type of service problems in the past? What challenges are you facing with your current solutions? How are these challenges affecting your business is a pretty good one. How much time / money do you spend on common industry challenge? Again, this is not meant to be copy paste, but it's meant to give you some guidelines around it, right? But as you're uncovering these individuals' problems, you can go ahead and see what's the best way to kind of position your product or solution accordingly. Uh, let's talk about personalization, because this is a pretty important topic within cold emails or cold outreach in general. So what I tell people always is like, go beyond first name and company name, but also at the same time, like, identify what the right variables you need are. I see a lot of individuals go, but like, hey, I saw you went to Ryerson University or you studied at CXL, and like, I'm like, okay, that's great, but that's not very relevant towards your outreach or to anything that I would be. It will not be relevant to any of my, I guess, decision making process around your solution. If that makes sense, because what you ideally want is you want to be looking at, okay, which variables are going to help me show that I'm a real individual doing the most appropriate outreach. So like, these are some great ones which you can usually get in an automated fashion, or worst case, hire a virtual assistant to kind of put in, right? I love seeing things like industry and city in it, because in your opening line can be like, or in the subject line be like, hey, solution for, and throw in the city name, right? Or talk about their previous company and be like, hey, notice you were the marketing manager at, you know, let's say at Apple. Well, we would be curious to see how we can help, because we've helped other Apple employees, right? Another element is site traffic. This is, I'm seeing, becoming more and more popular using technologies like Built With, and there was a tool there called Datanize, but now it's been acquired by, I think, ZoomInfo. But you can get site traffic also from SimilarWeb, right? So you can say, hey, notice your website has above 1 million hits on average. It has, throw in the site traffic variable. Okay, because you're a high traffic website, you should consider using this type of solution. It could be a chat bot, it could be an optimized page speed optimization thing, or an SEO tool, right? Other great stuff, especially if you're in MarTech, sales tech, or anything that's website related, is like, you can go and see what type of technology is being utilized to power that website, using tools like Built With, Wappleizer, Datanize, uh, LinkedIn Sales Navigator, and ZoomInfo has technology stack built into, I guess, their account list. So you can also see, okay, fine, like, let me identify people who are only using MailChimp or Salesforce Pardot or HubSpot, right? So use this information to further personalize and enrich your cold emails, right? And then last is like, if you're doing something more within your primary network, you can use mutual connections. Say, hey, notice we both are connected to Steve. Would love to connect and chat more, right? So do whatever you need to do, but to get the data onto a CSV, I would say, whether it's using tools or virtual assistants, but really learn how to leverage that in your cold emails, because I don't see that being done enough, unfortunately. I talked about this earlier, but let's move on to structure. So structure is probably the most important thing in this session, because I noticed that everyone has their own way of doing things. But this is the typical structure I use, and my team also kind of utilize it as well, right? So we open up with a salutation, we have the opening line, we have a supporting sentence, illumination question, one-liner, value proposition, along with some social proof, the ask, which is usually an open-ended question, sign off, and then using a PS. I heard this recently. PS is a great space to personalize some things, to just give that additional element that's saying, hey, I'm a human, I've done my research, or like, I really know more about your persona, right? So I think it's a very powerful item, and people really like detach it from the actual body. So even if you have 150 words for your main body, you can have like 10-15 words in the PS, and I think that's totally fine. So what does this look like in real time? So assume I was reaching out to Craig from Growth University for a cold email course, right? This is, I would say, more personalized and customized for Craig, but you can see in certain things what you can replace with certain variables. But anyway, hey Craig, saw Growth University launch its new live cohort recently. Congrats on cutting through the noise and making it to my feed. There's a growing demand for growth marketers to implement cold outreach programs. Is your program planning to offer a course on cold outreach? If you're open to it, would love to get involved and co-produce a course with you. Growth Rhino, my agency, has helped over 25 B2B venture fund startups launch scalable cold outreach programs. Feel free to check out some of the case studies here. Would it make sense to continue a conversation via email? Best, Ehan. P.S. Like hearing your podcast with Jason. Very inspiring to hear why exactly you want GU to help founders. Okay, so let's break this down a bit, right? Uh, hey, Craig. Again, want to keep it super conversational. Saw Growth Immunity launch its new live cohort recently. Congrats on cutting through the noise and making it to my feed. This is semi-humorous, but it's also like shows that I've done the research, right? Um, then I move into a transition and saying like, hey, there's a growing demand for growth markets to implement cold outreach programs. That's more of a setup for the illumination question that I'm going to ask next, but because that's like a little bit of, I would say, unique insight or research that I have that maybe Craig or might not have, right? And it's extremely relevant. Then I ask him like, are you planning to implement one, right? If so, great, would love to do this. And then I give him my pitch along with the respective social proof. The case studies here, I would hyperlink to my case studies page. And then the CTA is very frictionless. Like, hey, like, does this make sense? Like, if not, that's great. But if it does, then let's jump on a call and try to hash this out, right? And then again, I use the PS just more for like a personal remark to kind of boost a little bit more of the credibility around like I've done my research around you. Again, if we were trying to scale this, a little bit different, but we could definitely do it. Hey, Craig is just a first name. Growth University is a company name, right? I would use something similar if I'm reaching out to other individuals who've launched, let's say, other programs in growth marketing. Maybe tweak the opening line a little bit. I can leave. There's a growing demand for growth marketers to implement cold outreach programs. Is your program planning to offer a cold? So everything else can pretty much be the same, except maybe those few variables there and the personal remark. So you can see I can go ahead and sub some information here and make sure that as long as I have that information in the CSV, I'm good to go. Okay, so I hope that makes sense. And please feel free to reach out if there's any specific questions on this. I'm happy to always give my feedback on other people's cold emails. Um, just some notes on templates. I get asked a lot, like, hey, can you provide a template for this? I'm not the biggest fan of templates, and I'll tell you why. There's so many cookie cutter templates are online. You can go to HubSpot or any place, and you can get them readily available. I tried using them in the past when I was starting out, and like I didn't see the results I wanted, so I found them a waste of time, in all honesty. And it really didn't help the cause of like helping me understand like what makes a good cold email, right? So like we need to get into the habit of like logically thinking about the copy and that does it make sense, and getting into the habit of also experimenting, right? Um, we also need to try to understand like why did one email work versus another one? Like, was the copy better? Like, was the persona different? We talked about this in like I think in the earlier lessons. Like, uh, is that person in ready to buy mode versus just awareness stage, right? So like asking more questions like what works and what doesn't. So I really don't think templates is a good use of anybody's time. I follow this lady. Her name's Heather Morgan from Salesfolk. She runs a B2B agency as well, and she's actually co-authored some really good articles. And she's worked with predictable revenue. For those who don't know, predictable revenue is like one of those large, I guess now sales agency, but they also have a book a bit that was built on outbound prospecting. I believe 15 or 20 years ago, right? And she has a really good quote about this. She's like, look, an email template is only effective when it's personalized to your business, unique value proposition, and the audience that you're selling to. So what this means is like, hey, if I know that I'm gonna be reaching out to other founders of other, like, let's say, growth marketing program, I can templatize that, right? But for the most part, I'm not going to be able to find a template that will help me uh, do the respective outreach to growth marketing courses the way I just developed mine earlier. Okay, it's all about thinking about the persona, thinking about the problems, and then start using that type of structure and putting the respective items in that structure, and then start enriching the respective variables. Okay, let's briefly go over best practices. I also follow this individual, Florin Tatulia, really great individual. Highly recommend you also follow him. But one of the things he talks about is the whole battle between relevance versus personalization, and I 100% agree with him. Is that you really need to be relevant to your audience rather than being hyper personalized. What that means is like there's no point of you blasting 1,000 or 2,000 cold emails to a persona who you don't understand, right? And or hiring a bunch of VAs and be like, hey, VAs, go get me all this relevant information and start personalizing, and then you start personalizing at scale. But if your audience is not in ready to buy mode, or even like you've not defined it as individuals who are going to be maybe purchasing your solution in the next 3 to 6 months, it does not make sense to outreach unless you have a very different motivation to it, like what we talked about earlier, like it might be podcasts or backlinks or something like that. But for the most part, if you're trying to go get meetings with an individual or a specific cohort, uh, really you want to tie in relevancy, right? So you want to make sure you've tied in your persona research into your copy. Um, just to wrap up here, is that you want to make sure that your cold emails are able to obviously provoke curiosity, which we talked a little bit about there. Uh, it's also short and sweet. It's relevant. It's well researched for that respective persona, and then it's well personalized or decently personalized for that persona group as well. Just some final tips, because this is probably the most intense lesson in the whole course. Is like, look, copywriting is very hard. Writing sales copy for cold emails is even harder, right? Um, my best advice and suggestion is like just keep practicing and keep reading about what others are doing out there. I've mentioned some great people in this deck. Like, follow them on LinkedIn and Twitter. There's a bunch of other individuals, but I think that's a great starting point, right? The other element is like you want to keep practicing and keep learning. It will take time to perfect your writing style. And like the last and best piece of advice is like, hey, when you're in doubt, like just take a minute, step back, and just review your copy and like just ask yourself, like, does it make sense? Does the structure make sense? Does this vernacular make sense? And then ask yourself, like, would you respond to this email? And lastly, you want to be experimenting as much as you can to see what's resonating with your audience, because that's what's going to be making the difference at the end of the day. And that will give you hard, tangible data and help you optimize copy the way you need to. And we'll talk about that in upcoming lessons. With that, thank you so much for your attention, and I will see you in the next one. All right, take care.